Good morning, everyone. It is the day of Pentecost. Easter is the first great holiday of the church. The second great holiday is Christmas, and the third holiday of the church, believe it or not, is today, the day of Pentecost. It's the great holiday because it was on this day that the church began. It was on this day that God acted in a special way, and people began for the first time to proclaim the death and resurrection of Jesus. Last week, we spoke about Jesus' ascension. His disciples and he were headed towards the Mount of Olives, and on the way, Jesus told his disciples that they should go back to Jerusalem and wait for the coming of the Spirit. What are we going to wait for? How will the Spirit come? What will it look like? How will we know when the Spirit is here? A lot of questions, I'm sure, were raised in their minds. And nevertheless, after they saw Jesus return to the Father, they returned also to Jerusalem, and they waited. They prayed, they talked together, and they waited expectantly, not knowing what to look for, what to expect. It was 10 days later, on the day of Pentecost. This day of Pentecost was a Jewish holiday. Pentecost for the Jew was the day on which they celebrated the harvesting of the first fruits. It was also the day on which they celebrated the giving of the law. And so thousands upon thousands of people came from all different countries. Jews from every nation made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. They loved to be in Jerusalem when there were special holidays. Pentecost was one of them, these 50 days after Passover. And it was on this morning, at 9 o'clock in the morning, where the disciples are all gathered in one room again, where a mighty wind came in through the windows, circled all around. And as the disciples looked at one another, they saw flames of fire above each other. And they were inspired. They were inspired because now the Spirit of God, through this wind, had taken hold of them, and they knew what they had to do. They knew that they had to go out into the crowds of people, and they had to tell them about the death and resurrection of Jesus. They were given the gifts here of speaking all different kinds of languages. We're not just talking about speaking in tongues, which is a lot of gibberish, but actually speaking in the languages of the visitors from the foreign countries. And they left this upper room and began to tell everyone that they came in contact with about the death of Jesus and his subsequent resurrection. The people were astounded. Here were these Jews, Galileans, who were speaking their language. And they questioned it. How can they be speaking a language that we can hear and understand? They've got to be drunk. But Peter stood up and he said, "No, my friends, it's only 9 o'clock in the morning. These men are not drunk as you think, but rather they are filled with the Spirit. It's filled with God's Spirit. This is what the prophet Joel had spoken about many, many years ago, where one day God's Spirit would fill everyone, old, young, men, women. It didn't matter. His Spirit was meant for all. And here is the beginning of it. And they are telling you about Jesus. The thing that you should know, which we in English we don't get, but if you look at the Old Testament Hebrew, or if you look at the New Testament Greek, these were the languages that they were written in, you will see that the word for wind in either case and the word for spirit is the same. And so the translator, translating into English or what other language, has to decide, do I want to use the word wind or do I want to use the word spirit? The translation uses the appropriate word given the context. But there is this overlapping, you see, wind, spirit, spirit, wind. The wind comes into this room where the disciples are, and it is God's Spirit blowing into them. It's a mighty wind. And if we would be able to stop at this point and sit and talk, I could ask you, have you experienced anything like this? Have you experienced a mighty wind coming into your life that would change your life? The disciples' lives were now completely changed. They knew they had a goal, and they spent the rest of their lives telling people about Jesus, his death, his resurrection, and what that meant. They would die for this because they so fervently believed it. Has the wind of God, the Spirit of God, blown into your life in such a way that it has dramatically changed you? Perhaps a couple of you might say, yes, I can tell you of an experience. But many of you might not be able to do that. You haven't experienced God in that way. But this is not the only way in which God comes to us as a mighty wind. We can look back at Elijah, that great prophet in the Old Testament, in 1 Kings. Elijah felt that he was one of the few people who still believed in the true God, in Yahweh, as he was called. The rest of the country had begun to worship a false god by the name of Baal. And he had it, and he challenged the priests of Baal to a duel. He said, let's each of us slay a bull, and then we will pray to our respective gods to have the gods sent fire onto the sacrifice. The Baalists agreed, and so they slaughtered a bull and put it on an altar, and they began to pray and to prance and to wail and to shout. And it must have been quite the spectacle. There were 450 of these Baal priests, and they were going all around crying to Baal to set the sacrifice on fire. They were doing this for hours. And finally, Elijah torments them. And he says, well, where is he? Is he sleeping? Is he on vacation? Is he in the bathroom on the throne? Still, they persist, and nothing happens. And finally, Elijah has had it, and he said, all right, my turn. And he instructs his followers to take some water, some pails of water, and to cover the slaughtered ox. And when they'd done that, he said, do it a second time. And when they had thoroughly wet down the sacrifice a second time, he said, do it a third time. He wants to make sure that this bull is absolutely saturated. And then he prays. And he asks God to send fire upon the bull. Well, a bolt of lightning comes down and it burns the bull, the altar, and everything around it. And the people realize what's going on. They realize who the true God is. And at that point, Elijah says to his followers, all right, we have to slay the priests of Baal. And that's what they did. They killed every single one of them, all 450 of them. But then, even in spite of God's demonstration to Elijah, he becomes fearful for his life. Because Jezebel, the queen, a woman who had come from another country and married into the royal family, and she was the one who brought Baalism into the country. She was after him now. She was upset, and she was going to get Elijah. And so Elijah flees. He flees all the way down to the Sinai, to Mount Horeb, where he hides. He wants to die because he feels he's the only one who really believes in Yahweh. While he's hiding in a cave, the word of God comes to him, and the word says, come out. The Lord is going to pass by. And there is a mighty wind, and we're told that God was not in the wind. And there was an earthquake, and everything shook around him. Powerful demonstration. And we're told that God was not in the earthquake. And then there was fire all around, and God was not in the fire. And then there was the sound of nothingness. Then there was a barely perceptible breeze, and God was in that breeze. You see, when we look at wind can be strong and powerful. It can be, it can knock trees over, can bend them in half. I remember walking home a couple of years ago from the church, and a major storm was coming up, and I looked at one of the trees, and it was like it was doing the hula. It was just shaking back and forth quickly as possible, back and forth, back and forth. That's one way the wind can operate. The wind can also send a nice cooling trade wind if you're, say, down in the islands, the Caribbean. Or it can also send a very tiny, almost imperceptible breeze. And so, in the same way, you see, the Spirit comes. Jesus says, the wind comes and you don't know where it comes from or where it goes. You have no control over it. And it's the same thing with the Spirit. The Spirit comes as God wishes. But the Spirit comes to us in various ways. Sometimes it's a mighty wind, and sometimes it's almost an imperceptible breeze. And so if I would ask you, how many of you have experienced God in this way? There might be more of you saying, yes, we have experienced God in in this way, coming to us as a gentle breeze, coming to us from an unexpected place. Sometimes things happen, you see, that we realize after it's happened, we could have not put that together. We didn't know the people, we didn't know the places, we didn't know anything. And all of a sudden, it's there, right in front of us. And all we can do is marvel. It's the work of the Spirit. Edwin Booth, back in 1865, was considered the finest dramatic actor in the country. But he had many struggles. As he was growing up, his father was an alcoholic, and he eventually died from alcoholism. And he left his family stranded in California, 3,000 miles away from their home in Maryland. He overcame that. Edwin Booth married a woman by the name of Mary, and Mary died within 2 years of their marriage. He married another woman by the name of Mary, and she ended up becoming insane and spent her final years dealing with this insanity. And Edwin Booth spent his fortune on medical bills for Mary. On top of that, the worst thing that happened to him was what his brother John Wilkes Booth did. And of course you know that name. John Wilkes Booth assassinated President Abraham Lincoln. Edwin Booth was from the North. He was on the Union side. He thought that what Lincoln was doing was good. And he was very sorrowful when the president was killed. But even more so than that, he had to deal with the fact that it was his brother who assassinated the president. And he said, "What honor do I have left?" He felt totally miserable. And yet, as I said earlier, he was declared to be the finest dramatic actor in 1865. Something happened to Edwin Booth, which when you look at it and when he looked at it was very, very strange. He was over here in Jersey City, New Jersey. He was on a train station waiting for a train. And there was a great crowd, and all of a sudden he saw that the crowd ended up, because of its size, pushing a young man between the moving train and the station. And he was horrified, but immediately he dropped his valise, his suitcase, and he ran and grabbed the collar of this young man and pulled him back to safety. The young man looked at him. He recognized him because he was a popular figure. And he said, "That was a close call, Mr. Booth. Thank you." As it turns out, the man whom Edwin Booth saved was Robert Todd Lincoln. He was the son of the president whom his brother had assassinated. And for his whole life, he remembered this, and it gave him comfort. Whether he actually realized this was the work of the Spirit, I don't know. But we can look at it and see that God worked in this very, very miraculous way so that he could do something for this family. His brother killed the president. He saved the president's son's life. God works in ways that we don't understand. His Spirit comes to us, and he gives us the power to believe the gospel. However, whatever form that takes, he comes to us where we need him in a way that we can perceive him. He helps us believe. He sustains us. This is what Luther says that the Spirit is all about. The Spirit doesn't give us anything new except to tell us about the work of Jesus, the living Christ. The Spirit comes to us, and we rejoice. We rejoice on this day because we have been called now also to be part of his church, the church that began so many centuries ago. We are still called by the same Spirit to believe in the Jesus that the disciples first proclaimed. And we hang on to that faith as the Spirit gives us the power to do. Amen. The peace of God, which passes all understanding, keep your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Amen.